The air inside the Black Bear Tavern tasted of stale tobacco, spilled corn whiskey, and the heavy, damp rot of river mud. It was a miserable place, built of green pine logs that wept sticky sap down the walls. But tonight it was packed to the doors with human desperation. Men stood 3 deep near the smoky hearth, their boots caked in frozen mire, their eyes fixed on the makeshift platform in the center of the room. Upon that platform, standing on a sturdy oak table that groaned under her immense weight, was Elara. She stood tall, a monument of muscle and defiance, her broad shoulders braced against the low rafters. Her wrists were bound with coarse hemp rope that bit into her sun-baked skin, but her posture remained unbroken. She was a giant of a woman, a towering creature whose sheer physical presence intimidated every man in the room. Yet her amber eyes held the exhausting weariness of an animal that had run until its lungs were bloody. She had escaped the forced labor camps of the eastern rail lines only to be hunted down like a stray mare. And now she was being sold to the highest bidder to pay for her alleged passage across the territory. But the truth was far more complicated than anyone imagined. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The tavern keeper, a greasy individual with a voice like gravel grinding under a boot, pounded a wooden mallet against the bar. He pointed his dirty finger at Elara, shouting about her strength, her ability to plow a field without a mule, and the sheer volume of work those massive, corded arms could perform. The men laughed. A low, ugly sound that rippled through the smoky air. They looked at her not as a woman, but as a beast of burden, a physical curiosity to be mastered. Elara kept her gaze fixed on the small, frost-rimed window across the room. She refused to look at them. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch, even as the bidding began at a handful of silver dollars. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her heavy jaw remained set, her jawline tight with a fierce, silent dignity. In the darkest corner of the tavern sat Silas. He was a mountain of a man himself, his massive chest and shoulders dwarfing the heavy timber chair beneath him. He was a war veteran and a local blacksmith, a man who spoke only when the iron required it. A thick, silver scar cut a jagged path from his left temple down across his cheekbone, disappearing into his dense, dark beard. He had stayed in the shadows, wanting nothing to do with the noise of the town, but his quiet gray eyes had been fixed on Elara from the moment she was dragged inside. He saw the way her thick forearms strained against the ropes, revealing muscles that matched his own in their sheer, rugged power. But more than her size, Silas saw her eyes. He recognized that specific brand of exhaustion. It was the look of a soul that had survived a massacre and was merely waiting for the final blow to fall. The bidding rose slowly, driven by 2 farmers who argued over who needed her strength more for the spring clearing. Elara stood motionless, though the muscles in her powerful calves flexed involuntarily against the rough wood of the table. She closed her eyes, preparing herself for the worst, knowing that whatever man claimed her would see her only as a monster to be broken. Silas stood up. His massive frame seemed to block out the firelight, and the corner of the tavern grew suddenly quiet as he moved forward. He did not rush. He walked with a slow, heavy deliberation, his steel-toed boots thudding against the floorboards. The crowd parted instinctively, men moving aside to avoid brushing against his broad shoulders. He stopped at the edge of the platform, looking up at Elara. For a single, fleeting second, her amber eyes dropped to meet his stormy gray gaze. she did not see mockery in his face. She saw only a hard, scarred solemnity that made her breath hitch in her throat. Silas reached into the pocket of his heavy leather apron and pulled out a small canvas sack. It clinked with the heavy, unmistakable sound of gold coin. He did not look at the tavern keeper. He kept his eyes on Elara as he tossed the sack onto the center of the table. The wood cracked under the impact. Silas spoke, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that silenced the entire room. He stated that the woman was no longer for sale. He told the tavern keeper that the gold in the sack was double what any man in the territory could offer, and that he was taking her. The tavern keeper blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. He reached for the gold, nodding rapidly, his greed instantly overcoming his surprise. The rest of the room remained dead silent. No man dared to challenge the scarred blacksmith, not when his massive biceps were tensed and his expression was as cold as winter iron. Silas stepped closer to the table. He did not reach for Elara roughly. Instead, he drew a simple, sharp hunting knife from his belt. Elara flinched, her heavy shoulders tensing as she prepared for pain. But Silas merely reached out, his large, calloused hand steadying her bound wrists for a brief moment before he slid the blade through the hemp rope. The cords severed instantly, falling to the floorboards. Elara lowered her arms, her hands free for the first time in days. She rubbed her chafed wrists, staring down at the giant who had just altered her destiny. Silas stepped back, giving her space, his posture entirely non-threatening despite his intimidating size. He gestured toward the door with a slight nod of his head. He told her that his cabin was 3 miles up the mountain trail, and that the wind was shifting toward snow. He turned and began to walk away, expecting her to follow. Elara hesitated for only a heartbeat. She looked at the hostile faces of the men in the tavern, then at the broad, scarred back of the blacksmith who had given her back her freedom. She stepped down from the table, her heavy boots hitting the floor with a solid thud, and followed him out into the freezing night. The cold air hit her face like a slap, clearing the stench of the tavern from her lungs. Silas walked ahead of her, his massive shoulders cutting through the darkness, never looking back to see if she was there. Elara walked a few paces behind him, her mind spinning with a mixture of caution and profound confusion. She was no longer a prisoner, but she was entirely dependent on a stranger whose silence was as vast as the mountains around them. The trail began to steepen, the pine trees closing in around them like silent sentinels. The silence between them grew heavy, filled only by the sound of their synchronized, heavy footsteps crunching through the frozen pine needles. Elara watched the back of his head, wondering what a man like him wanted with a woman like her. She knew what people thought of her size. She knew she was expected to be a servant or worse. She tightened her jaw, her fingers curling into powerful fists inside her pockets. If he tried to break her, he would find that her spirit was as dense as her muscle. A sudden gust of wind howled through the canyon, bringing the first sharp flakes of winter snow. Silas stopped. He turned slowly, his gray eyes catching the faint light of the stars. He looked at her thin, frayed coat, then down at her shivering, muscular frame. Without a word, he began to unbuckle his own heavy, wool-lined coat. Elara stepped back, her posture instantly defensive, her amber eyes narrowing in suspicion. She did not want his charity, and she did not trust his gentleness. Silas paused, his large hands holding the thick wool coat open between them. He did not advance toward her. He stood like an ancient cedar tree, unaffected by the freezing wind that whipped around his massive shoulders. His gray eyes remained steady, observing the sharp, defensive angle of her jaw and the way her powerful biceps bunched beneath her thin homespun shirt. He could see the distrust radiating from her towering frame, a palpable wall of resistance built from years of harsh treatment. He did not argue, nor did he command her to take the garment. Instead, he simply draped the heavy coat over a low-hanging pine branch between them, stepped back to restore the distance she required, and turned to continue up the rocky path. Elara stood frozen as the snow began to fall in earnest, the white flakes swirling against her warm olive skin. She looked at the branch where the coat hung, smelling the rich scents of wood smoke, old iron, and clean pine that clung to the heavy wool. Her pride urged her to leave it, to prove that her physical power was absolute and that she could withstand the mountain winter without assistance. But the biting cold was relentless, and her deep, exhaustive weariness was beginning to dull the edges of her stubbornness. She reached out, her large, calloused hand gripping the thick material. When she slipped her arms into the sleeves, she was surprised to find that it fit her broad back and heavily muscled shoulders perfectly, a rare occurrence for a woman of her unusual stature. The warmth wrapped around her like a protective shield, slowing the shivering that had begun to deep-fry her core. She quickened her pace to close the distance, her heavy boots crunching rhythmically behind his. Silas kept a steady, unhurried gait, his massive boots carving a clear trail through the gathering drifts for her to follow. He did not look back to confirm she had taken the coat, but the subtle relaxation of his broad shoulders suggested he knew. As they climbed higher into the jagged throat of the canyon, the lights of the distant settlement vanished beneath the curtain of white. The world became a landscape of stark contrasts, a wilderness of black rock and pale snow. Elara watched the giant ahead of her, her mind turning over the events of the evening. She had spent her entire life being feared or exploited for her strength. Men either backed away from her in intimidation or sought to chain her to a plow like a beast. Yet this scarred veteran, whose physical power clearly matched or exceeded her own, had treated her with a strange, hands-off respect. He had not demanded her name, nor had he laid a hand on her since cutting her bonds. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the ravine, like the sound of a rifle shot. Elara instantly dropped low, her massive thighs flexing as she assumed a defensive crouch, her amber eyes scanning the darkness for danger. Her breath came in short, white puffs. Ahead of her, Silas had also stopped, but he had not drawn a weapon. He pointed up toward the ridge, where a large pine branch had snapped under the heavy weight of the fresh snow, tumbling harmlessly down the cliffside. Silas turned his head slightly, his gray eyes locking onto her tense, defensive posture. He murmured that the mountain spoke loud in the winter, but it rarely lied. His voice was a low, soothing vibration that seemed to calm the frantic beating of her heart. He waited until she straightened her posture and relaxed her fists before he turned back to the trail. The gesture was small, but it added a new layer to her growing confusion. He was allowing her to set the pace of her own safety. He was not rushing her, nor was he dismissing her vigilance. For a woman who had spent months escaping men who wished to cage her, this absence of pressure felt entirely unnatural, yet deeply grounding. They turned a sharp bend in the trail, and the dense tree line opened into a small, sheltered meadow beneath a towering granite bluff. In the center of the clearing stood a sturdy log cabin, its roof thick with sod and its stone chimney rising like a dark finger against the snowy sky. A small blacksmith forge sat adjacent to the main structure. The heavy iron anvil cold and silent under a lean-to roof. Silas walked to the heavy oak door of the cabin, lifting the wooden latch. He stepped inside and immediately struck a match, lighting a kerosene lamp that hung from a central rafter. The golden light bloomed across the interior, revealing a space that was simple, clean, and entirely functional. A large stone hearth dominated one wall. A massive oak table sat near the small window, and a wide bed piled high with quilts occupied the far corner. The air inside was cold, but it carried the comforting scent of cured hickory and dried herbs. Silas did not invite her in with words. He stepped to the hearth, kneeling his massive frame before the cold ashes. His large, scarred hands worked with practiced efficiency, shaving kindling with his hunting knife and striking a flint until a small, orange flame caught the dry wood. He fed the fire patiently, his broad back turned to her, showing an immense amount of trust by leaving his vulnerabilities exposed to her physical power. Elara stepped across the threshold, her heavy boots leaving patches of melting snow on the rough-hewn floorboards. She stayed close to the door, her amber eyes assessing every corner of the room, looking for ropes, locks, or any sign that this sanctuary was another cage. She kept her hands inside the pockets of the oversized coat, her knuckles white with tension. The fire caught, the dry hickory popping and throwing a warm, cheerful glow across the logs. The temperature in the room began to rise, chasing away the frosty chill that clung to their clothes. Silas stood up, dusting the soot from his hands. He did not look at her directly, sensing that his intense gaze might cause her to retreat. He gestured toward the wide bed in the corner, with its thick, hand-woven quilts. He murmured that the bed belonged to her for the night, and that the latch on the door secured from the inside. Elara blinked, her voice catching in her throat before she could form the words. She asked where he intended to sleep. Silas picked up a heavy wool blanket from a storage chest near the woodpile. He looked at her then, his stormy eyes softening with a quiet, protective intensity that made her chest tighten. He stated that he would be keeping watch in the forge, ensuring that the fire remained fed from the outside, and that the storm did not compromise the roof. He reached for the door handle, preparing to step back out into the freezing night. Elara took a step forward, her hand instinctively rising as if to stop him, though she did not make physical contact. A profound sense of confusion and a sudden, sharp fear of the loneliness outside gripped her. She did not understand why a man would pay a fortune in gold, offer his home, and then banish himself to a freezing forge just to provide her with safety. Silas halted with his large hand resting on the heavy iron latch of the door. The wind howled outside, throwing a spray of dry, icy snow against the log walls, a stark reminder of the wilderness that surrounded their fragile shelter. He turned his head slowly, his stormy gray eyes meeting her amber gaze in the flickering firelight. He did not speak immediately. He allowed the silence to stretch between them, a deliberate choice that gave her towering, defensive frame room to breathe. He could see the conflict warring within her, the deep-seated instinct to guard against malice balanced against the raw, aching exhaustion that bowed her powerful shoulders. He lowered his hand from the latch, his posture remaining perfectly still, as unyielding as the anvil in his forge. He told her that a lock was only as good as the peace of mind behind it, and that she owed him no explanations. Nor did she owe him her trust before she was ready to give it. Elara let her hand drop to her side, her fingers curling slightly into the thick wool of his coat. The fabric still held the comforting heat of his body, a striking contrast to the biting cold she had endured for weeks. She looked from his scarred, solemn face to the wide bed in the corner, where the hand-woven quilts offered a promise of comfort she had not known since her flight began. Her massive thighs trembled slightly, a physical reaction to the miles they had covered and the intense emotional strain of the auction block. She pulled her chin up, her heavy jaw setting firmly as she found her voice. She stated that she had never been a woman who required a man to freeze on her account, and that the cabin was large enough for two people who knew how to respect a boundary. A faint, if almost imperceptible shadow of a smile touched the edge of Silas's dark beard, though his expression remained mostly hidden. He acknowledged her words with a single, respectful nod. He walked across the room with his slow, heavy deliberation in unison, ensuring each footstep was loud and predictable so as not to startle her. He knelt by the woodpile, lifting two massive hickory logs with a single arm, his biceps straining against the fabric of his sleeve with a display of raw power that mirrored her own physical capabilities. He placed the wood into the hearth, sending a shower of orange sparks up the chimney, then moved to the large oak table. He picked up a wooden trencher containing a loaf of dense, crusty brown bread and a wedge of hard cheese, placing it near the fire where the heat would soften it. He murmured that a long trail required a heavy fuel, and that he would take his rest by the hearth, where the draft was strongest. Elara watched him move, her amber eyes tracking his efficiency. There was no wasted motion in his massive frame, no aggressive display designed to assert dominance over her. He treated his own immense strength as a simple tool, a necessity for survival rather than a weapon of intimidation. This realization allowed a small, fragile layer of the tension in her chest to dissolve. She walked toward the table, her heavy boots clacking softly against the floorboards, and sat down on a sturdy bench. She took a piece of the dark bread, her calloused fingers breaking it apart with ease. The simple, wholesome taste of grain and salt filled her mouth, and she closed her eyes, savoring the first proper meal she had tasted in days. Silas took his place on the opposite side of the hearth, rolling his heavy wool blanket into a makeshift bolster and leaning his broad back against the log wall. He pulled his legs up, his massive knees nearly reaching his chest, and rested his large hands on his shins. He did not stare at her while she ate. He kept his eyes on the dancing flames, his breathing slow and rhythmic, creating an atmosphere of safety that was entirely undemanding. The warmth of the fire filled the room, the golden light carving deep shadows across his scarred cheek and highlighting the silver lines of old battles. As the wind continued to lash at the cabin exterior, the silence between them became a living thing, no longer hostile, but reflective. Elara finished her meal, wiping her hands on her trousers. She looked at the giant across the fire, observing the way the silver scar cut through his features. She wondered what kind of war had left such a mark on a man who seemed so inherently protective. She had seen veterans before. Most were hollowed out or driven to a wild, unpredictable cruelty by the things they had witnessed. Yet Silas seemed to have channeled his history into a profound, quiet stillness. She stood up, her towering height casting a long shadow across the room. She moved to the wide bed, her large hands smoothing the top quilt. It was soft, smelling of dried lavender and fresh air, a sensory detail that felt entirely out of place in this rugged, isolated mountain sanctuary. She lay down fully clothed, keeping her boots on her feet out of a lingering, habitual need for readiness. She pulled the heavy quilts up to her broad shoulders, her muscles finally relaxing into the deep canvas mattress. She watched the ceiling beams, the golden firelight dancing across the rough sawn pine. For the first time in months, the frantic, chasing thoughts in her mind, began to slow. The heavy weight of her physical body felt supported, grounded by the solid logs of the cabin and the silent presence of the man by the hearth. She looked over at Silas one last time before her eyelids grew heavy. He had not moved. His large frame remained positioned between her and the door, an impenetrable barrier against whatever evils the frontier might hold. She let out a long, shuddering sigh, her breath catching once before she slid into a deep, dreamless sleep. Hours passed, the night deepening until the fire burned down to a bed of glowing red coals. The storm outside reached its peak, the timbers of the cabin groaning under the immense pressure of the gale. A sudden, violent blast of wind rattled the heavy shutter on the small window, forcing a thin stream of freezing air and white powder through a narrow gap in the casing. Elara woke instantly. Her amber eyes snapped open in the darkness, her muscular frame bolting upright in the bed before her mind could fully process her surroundings. Her heart hammered against her ribs, the old terror of the captivity she had fled rushing back into her veins like ice water. She gasped, her large hand reaching for the knife she no longer possessed, her breathing coming in fast, shallow pants that shook her chest. Through the dim, ruby glow of the dying embers, she saw Silas shift. He did not rise suddenly, which might have provoked her defense, but he straightened his massive back against the wall. His gray eyes caught the faint light, steady and calm in the shadows. He breathed a single, low word into the darkness, a quiet reassessment of the structure that was meant to soothe her panic. He told her that the roof tree was solid, and that the storm could only knock on the door. It could not enter. Elara gripped the edges of the quilt, her knuckles aching with the force of her hold. She looked at his large, dark silhouette, her mind trembling on the edge of a deep, emotional precipice. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that this small cabin was the end of her flight. But the world had taught her that every sanctuary had its price. She looked down at her hands, her voice barely a whisper as she asked him what he expected of her when the snow cleared and the trail opened. Silas remained motionless in the dim, amber shadow of the dying fire. The wind continued its relentless assault on the heavy cedar shingles overhead. But, inside, the silence between them stretched out, thick and heavy with unspoken history. He adjusted his position slowly, his massive shoulders sliding down the rough log wall until he was leaning forward, his large, calloused hands loosely clasped between his knees. The silver scar on his cheek caught a passing glint of red light from the hearth, making the hard lines of his face appear even more weathered. He did not look at her with urgency or expectation. He kept his gaze lowered, fixed on the gray ash that dusted the hearthstones. He murmured that a free horse does not owe the field anything for the grass it eats, and that when the drifts melted, she could walk north to the valley settlements or south toward the railhead, and he would not lift a finger to hinder her. Elara slowly released her white-knuckled grip on the quilt, the tension draining from her powerful fingers with a dull ache. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her heavy leather boots touching the floorboards with a soft, deliberate thud. Her massive frame loomed large in the shadow of the cabin, her shoulders nearly as broad as Silas's own, yet she felt strangely small under the weight of his simple honesty. She rested her large forearms on her knees, her amber eyes searching his dark silhouette. For a woman who had her entire life paying for every scrap of food and every moment of shelter with the sweat of her brow or the bruising of her flesh, his words felt like a foreign tongue. She stated that no man paid a fortune in gold coin just to let a good pair of shoulders walk away into the timber without a return on his investment. Silas did not flinch at the cynicism in her voice. He understood it too well. It was the same armor he had worn for years after the war had stripped him of everything but his skin and his breath. He rose to his feet with a slow, mountain-like grandeur, his head clearing the high ceiling beams by only a few inches. He walked over to the woodpile, lifted a thick log of seasoned hickory with one hand, and placed it onto the embers. A fresh burst of golden light erupted from the hearth, illuminating the room and casting their twin, muscular shadows across the ceiling. He looked at her then, his winter-gray eyes direct and filled with a quiet solemnity. He stated that he had bought her dignity from a fool who did not know the value of a human soul, not her labor, and that the only thing he expected from any living creature under his roof was that they breathe peaceable. The honesty in his voice was like a physical weight, settling into the room and chasing away the lingering ghosts of the tavern auction block. Elara looked down at her calloused palms, tracing the deep lines carved into her skin by years of hard work. She felt a sudden, unfamiliar warmth bloom in her chest, a soft contrast to the icy distrust that had guarded her heart for so long. She realized that this giant man, despite his imposing size and the fierce scar that marked his face, possessed a spirit that was remarkably gentle. She pulled her thick hair back over her broad shoulder, her jaw relaxing as she let out a long, slow breath. When the morning sun finally broke through the gray curtain of the storm, it revealed a world buried in 3 feet of pristine, white snow. The light poured through the small window, sparkling against the frost patterns on the glass and filling the cabin with a bright, clean brilliance. Silas was already awake, his massive leather apron tied around his waist, his bare arms glistening with a light sheen of sweat as he worked near the cold stove. He had already baked a fresh batch of sourdough biscuits, the rich, buttery scent filling the air and making Elara's stomach rumble with a fierce hunger. She stepped out of the bed, stretching her long, muscular limbs until her joints popped in the quiet room. She moved to the table, where Silas had placed a steaming tin mug of black coffee and a plate of hot biscuits. He did not wait for her to thank him. He merely nodded toward the food before picking up his heavy iron shovel and heading out the door to clear the drifts from the forge. Elara ate quickly, her powerful jaws making short work of the hearty meal. The heat of the coffee spread through her veins, renewing her physical strength and clearing the last remnants of sleep from her brain. She looked out the window, watching Silas through the glass. He was moving mountains of snow with effortless, rhythmic strokes of his shovel, his massive biceps swelling beneath his shirt with each lift. She could not simply sit by the fire while another person labored on her behalf. Her pride and her natural inclination toward hard work would not allow it. She grabbed the heavy wool coat he had lent her the night before, slipping her thick arms into the sleeves, and stepped outside into the blinding white light. The air was crisp and biting, freezing the breath in her nostrils, but the sun felt warm against her face. She walked over to the woodpile, where a massive double-bitted axe was buried in a chopping stump. She gripped the hickory handle with both hands, her fingers fitting perfectly around the worn wood, and hauled the heavy tool free. Silas paused his shoveling, leaning on the handle of his spade as he watched her from across the yard. His gray eyes narrowed slightly, not in disapproval, but in a quiet, appreciative assessment of her form. Elara did not hesitate. She hauled a massive round of frozen oak onto the block, balanced her heavy boots in the snow, and brought the axe down with a ferocious, fluid swing. The heavy iron blade bit deep into the wood, splitting the frozen oak clean in two with a sharp, echoing crack that resonated through the valley. She did not stop. She reached for another log, her broad shoulders working in perfect harmony with her powerful thighs, her movements as efficient and tireless as a steam engine. For the first time in her life, she did not feel the need to hide her strength or apologize for her size. She looked up from the chopping block, her face flushed with exertion, her amber eyes meeting Silas's gaze through the clear winter air. He did not speak a word, but the slow, respectful nod he gave her from across the snow-covered yard felt like the highest praise she had ever received. They worked in silence for over an hour, the rhythmic thud of the axe and the scrape of the shovel, creating a primitive harmony in the isolated clearing. By the time they finished, a neat, massive wall of firewood had been stacked against the cabin wall, and a wide, clear path had been carved through the drifts between the house and the forge. Elara wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her sleeve, her chest heaving slightly as she enjoyed the deep, satisfying ache of honest labor. Silas walked over to her, his heavy boots crunching in the snow. He stopped a few feet away, his chest broad and expanded from his own work. He looked at the perfectly split wood, then down at the heavy axe, still gripped in her large hand. He murmured that the mountain had met its match in her shoulders, and that he had never seen an oak log split so clean with a single blow. Elara felt a sudden, intense prickle of self-consciousness, her old fears whispering that he was merely mocking her unusual power. She tightened her grip on the axe handle, her jaw setting as she looked into his eyes, searching for the familiar sneer she had seen on so many men's faces before. But Silas's expression was entirely earnest, his gray eyes shining with an unforced admiration that made her breath catch in her throat. Before she could form a reply, a strange, low vibration rumbled through the valley, distinct from the wind. It was the distant, unmistakable sound of multiple horses plowing through the heavy snow down on the main trail, their iron-shod hooves striking the hidden rocks below. Silas went perfectly still, his massive frame locking like an iron brace as his head turned toward the narrow throat of the canyon. His gray eyes, previously soft with admiration, hardened into flint as he listened to the heavy, rhythmic thuds vibrating through the frozen crust of the snow. Elara lowered the axe, her broad shoulders instantly tensing as her amber eyes followed his gaze. The warmth of her hard labor vanished, replaced by a sudden, icy knot of apprehension that tightened in the pit of her stomach. She knew that sound. It was the heavy, unhurried gait of mount horses ridden by men who had a purpose. Men who were not deterred by a mountain blizzard. Silas reached down, his large hand wrapping around the handle of the axe she held. He did not pull it from her grasp. He merely took the weight of it, his touch firm and grounded. He murmured that she should go inside the cabin and draw the heavy iron bolt across the oak door. His voice was no longer a gentle rumble. It had dropped into a low, commanding register that carried the unmistakable authority of a man who had commanded men in the smoke of battle. He told her that he would handle whatever business was coming up the trail, and that she did not need to expose herself to the cold. Elara did not move toward the cabin. She looked at his scarred face, the silver line across his cheek pulsing slightly as his jaw muscles clenched. She stated that she had spent too long running from trouble to hide behind a piece of pine wood while another man stood in the clearing for her. Her towering height matched his stance, her muscular frame refusing to shrink or cower. She had survived the brutal rail camps by relying on her own immense power, and she would not play the part of a helpless maiden now. Silas looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes measuring the stubborn defiance in her jawline. A subtle shift occurred in his expression, a silent recognition of her independent spirit that seemed to deepen his respect for her even further. He released his grip on the axe handle, letting his hand fall back to his side. He murmured that a partner in the timber was better than a wall, but that she must keep her eyes open and her back to the bluff. Within minutes, 3 riders broke through the dense tree line at the edge of the meadow. Their horses were large, powerful beasts, their chests caked in frozen white powder and their nostrils blowing thick plumes of steam into the crisp morning air. The man leading the group was a lean, hawk-faced individual wearing a heavy beaver fur coat and a low-slung gun belt. His eyes were small, dark, and restless, scanning the clearing with a practiced, predatory efficiency. This was Vance, a notorious bounty hunter known throughout the territory for tracking down escaped laborers and returning them to the companies for a heavy price. Vance pulled his horse to a halt a few yards from where Silas and Elara stood. His gaze bypassed the blacksmith entirely, locking onto Elara's towering, muscular form with an ugly, triumphant grin. He rubbed his gloved hands together, his voice a sharp, nasal whine that broke the pristine silence of the mountain. He stated that he had tracked her through the drifts from the Black Bear Tavern, and that the railroad company was offering a handsome reward for the return of their most valuable property. Silas took a single, massive step forward, his broad chest blocking Vance's view of Elara. The silver scar on his temple seemed to white out against his dark skin as his features hardened into an expression of absolute, unyielding stone. He did not reach for a weapon, but his large hands curled into fists that looked capable of crushing river rock. He stated that the woman belonged to no company, and that her debt had been paid in full at the auction block the night before. His voice was a low, dangerous growl that made Vance's horse shift its weight uneasily in the snow. Vance sneered, his fingers twitching near the butt of his pistol. He remarked that a blacksmith's coin did not override a federal labor contract, and that he had 2 men behind him who were paid to handle anyone who interfered with company business. He gestured toward the 2 rough-looking individuals riding behind him, both of whom had their hands resting heavily on the stocks of their carbines. Elara felt a surge of hot, defensive fury rush through her veins, drowning out the lingering remnants of her fear. She stepped up beside Silas, her towering height creating an impenetrable wall of muscle next to his own. She raised the heavy axe slightly, the iron blade gleaming in the winter sun, her amber eyes blazing with an untamed ferocity that made the 2 riders hesitate. She stated that any man who tried to put a rope back on her wrists would find out how clean an oak handle could split a skull. The tension in the clearing became a living, breathing thing, as tight and fragile as a frozen wire. Vance looked from Silas's massive, scarred face to Elara's powerful, unyielding stance. He realized that this was not a simple retrieval. He was facing 2 giants who were prepared to turn the white snow red before they surrendered an inch of their dignity. He narrowed his dark eyes, his mind calculating the cost of a gunfight against a war veteran and a woman who handled a double-bitted axe like a toy. Vance slowly pulled back on his reins, his horse taking a few steps backward into the deeper drifts. He spit a stream of dark tobacco juice into the pristine snow, his face twisting into a bitter, venomous grimace. He muttered that a mountain cabin was a lonely place to die for a piece of runaway property, and that he would return with enough iron to level the structure to the ground. He turned his horse around with a sharp jerk, signaling his men to follow him back down the steep trail. The 3 riders disappeared into the dark timber, the sound of their horses' hooves fading slowly into the distance until the valley was once again silent. Elara did not lower the axe immediately. She kept her gaze fixed on the tree line, her chest heaving with the remnants of her adrenaline, her muscular forearms trembling slightly from the intensity of her grip. She looked over at Silas, expecting to see the first signs of regret or panic on his face. He had just made an enemy of a powerful bounty hunter, risking his peaceful life and his business for a woman he had known for less than a day. Silas turned toward her, his expression returning to its habitual, quiet solemnity. He did not look worried about Vance's threats. He reached out, his large customer, calloused fingers gently taking the axe from her hand and placing it back into the chopping stump. He looked into her amber eyes, his stormy gray gaze carrying a deep, reassuring safety that made her knees feel weak. He murmured that a threat on the wind was just noise until it hit the door, and that they had more wood to stack before the noon heat softened the snow. The contrast between his calm demeanor and the violence they had just averted was staggering. Elara felt a profound sense of emotional safety washing over her, a feeling so sweet and intense that it frightened her more than Vance's guns. She followed him back toward the cabin, her mind spinning with a new, terrifying question. Silas was willing to protect her from the world, but what would happen when Vance returned, with the authority of the law behind him? The cabin interior felt smaller now, the heavy log walls seeming to draw closer together as the midday sun struck the small glass pane of the window. The bright light illuminated the dancing dust motes in the air, casting long, geometric shadows across the rough-hewn floorboards. Elara sat on the edge of the heavy oak bench, her long legs stretched out toward the hearth, her large hands loosely clasped between her knees. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation with Vance had drained away, leaving her with a hollow, throbbing exhaustion that reached deep into her muscular thighs. She watched the flames lick at the fresh hickory log Silas had placed in the stove, the quiet popping of the dry wood, the only sound breaking the heavy stillness of the room. Silas stood by the small washstand near the corner, his massive back turned to her. He had removed his heavy wool coat, and his bare, corded arms glistened under a thin layer of moisture as he poured fresh well water into a tin basin. The sheer physical dimensions of his frame seemed to absorb the ambient light, his broad shoulders nearly blocking out the corner of the room. He washed his face and hands with deliberate, unhurried movements, the splashing of the water creating a rhythmic, soothing counterpoint to the howling wind that still whispered through the high pines outside. He dried himself with a coarse piece of linen, then turned around slowly, his winter-gray eyes locking onto her guarded posture. He did not offer empty words of comfort, nor did he dismiss the gravity of what had just occurred in the clearing. He walked over to the table with his slow, heavy stride, carrying a small stoneware jar filled with a thick, green salve made from pine resin and wild tallow. He placed the jar on the table near her hand, then sat down on the opposite end of the bench, ensuring he left a respectful distance between their massive frames. He murmured that the hemp rope from the Tavern Block had left a nasty bite on her wrists, and that the resin would draw out the heat before the skin turned angry. Elara looked down at her wrists, noticing for the first time the raw, purple welts that ringed her sun-baked skin where the coarse fibers had chafed during her long captivity. She had been so focused on survival that she had entirely ignored the throbbing ache in her joints. She reached for the jar, but her large fingers, stiff from the freezing cold and the tension of holding the heavy axe, fumbled with the wooden lid. Silas did not comment on her sudden clumsiness. He simply reached out, his massive, calloused hand covering hers for a fraction of a second as he took the jar from her grasp. He unscrewed the lid with an easy twist of his thumb and forefinger, revealing the fragrant, herbal ointment within. He did not apply it himself. He placed the open jar back into her palm, his touch light and entirely non-threatening despite the immense power contained within his scarred arms. Elara dipped her finger into the cool salve, smoothing it over the torn skin of her left wrist. The relief was instantaneous, a soothing chill that seemed to reach all the way down to her bones. She worked in silence for a moment, her amber eyes tracking the movement of Silas's hands as he rested them on his thighs. His fingers were long and thick, the knuckles scarred from decades of striking hot iron against the anvil. Yet, there was a remarkable precision in the way he carried himself. She pulled her chin up, her heavy jaw tightening as she looked directly into his face, tracing the silver line of the scar that cut through his dark beard. She stated that Vance was not a man who made idle threats, and that he would return with the territorial marshal before the snow cleared from the lower valley. Silas did not look away from her intense gaze. His gray eyes remained as steady as the granite bluff behind the cabin. He reached up, his thumb brushing against the silver scar on his temple with a slow, habitual gesture that spoke of old memories. He muttered that the marshal was a reasonable man, who knew the difference between a real crime and a railroad contract, bought with blood money, and that no man would be dragged from this mountain while he still had breath to lift a hammer. His voice was low, a deep vibration that seemed to settle the frantic, chasing thoughts that had been hammering against Elara's ribs since the riders appeared. The absolute certainty in his tone provided a profound sense of emotional safety, a feeling that was entirely unfamiliar to a woman who had spent her life relying solely on her own physical dominance to protect herself. Elara felt a sudden, intense prickle of vulnerability behind her eyelids. She looked down at her large, muscular forearms, her voice dropping into a quiet, reflective murmur. She stated that she had never had a person stand between her and a storm before, and that most men either ran from her size or tried to use it until there was nothing left but bone. Silas shifted his position on the bench, his massive knee brushing lightly against her trousers, a fleeting contact that sent a strange, warm current through her veins. He looked at her towering, powerful frame, his expression filled with a deep, unforced respect that carried no trace of the mockery she had grown to expect from the world. He stated that true strength was not a thing to be feared or exploited, but a shield meant to shelter the things that were quiet and good, and that her shoulders were built to carry a life, not a chain. The words were simple, yet they delivered a powerful emotional catharsis that made Elara's chest heave with a silent, shuddering breath. She realized that this scarred veteran did not see her as a freak or a monster to be mastered. He saw her as a whole human being, worthy of dignity, protection at Stover, and a place to belong. The emotional distance that had kept them apart since the tavern began to melt away, replaced by a deep, mutual understanding that required no further explanation. The afternoon wore on, the golden sunlight shifting across the cabin floor until the room was bathed in the long, violet shadows of twilight. The storm outside had finally passed, leaving the mountain valley wrapped in a pristine, breathless silence. They prepared a simple supper of salt pork and boiled potatoes, working together in the small kitchen space with a quiet efficiency that felt as natural as if they had shared the hearth for years. Their massive bodies moved in perfect harmony around the small stove, each instinctively giving the other room to move without a single word being spoken. When the night finally descended, bringing a bitter, cracking frost that made the log walls pop in the dark, Silas took his place once again by the hearth. He rolled himself into his heavy blanket, his large frame positioned between the bed and the door, a silent sentinel against the darkness. Elara lay down beneath the hand-woven quilts, her muscles relaxed and her mind entirely at peace. She watched the crimson glow of the embers fade slowly into gray ash, her ears listening to the slow, deep rhythm of Silas's breathing across the room. She felt entirely safe, wrapped in the warmth of his coat and the security of his unyielding presence. Yet, as she drifted off to sleep, a small, persistent question lingered in the corners of her mind. Silas had promised to protect her from Vance and the law. But what would happen to this fragile sanctuary when the spring came? And the world demanded that they both account for the price he had paid on the Tavern Block. The morning brought a brilliant, blinding glare as the sun reflected off the fresh snowbanks, casting sharp spears of white light through the small cabin window. Inside, the heat from the wood stove was thick and comforting, smelling faintly of the cornmeal mush that Silas had set to simmer in a heavy iron pot. Elara stood by the washstand, her large hands smoothing the front of her patched denim trousers. She felt a deep, unfamiliar sense of physical comfort in the quiet space, her massive muscles no longer locked in the constant, defensive readiness that had defined her existence for so long. She looked over at the table where Silas sat, his massive leather apron tied snugly around his waist, his bare, corded arms resting heavily on the clean oak surface. The quiet between them was broken by the sudden, heavy thud of a boot striking the front porch. Silas rose to his feet instantly, his immense frame blocking out the light from the hearth as his hand moved with fluid, military precision to the stock of the rifle, leaning against the wall. He did not chamber around, but his gray eyes narrowed into hard slits as he moved toward the heavy door. Elara stepped up right behind him, her broad shoulders squared, her amber eyes fixed on the thick oak timber as the wooden latch rattled from the outside. She did not seek a place to hide. Her towering height matched his stance, her powerful biceps tensing as she prepared to face whatever danger had tracked them up the mountain. Silas hauled the door open with a swift, powerful pull, his massive body ready to absorb a blow. Standing on the threshold was not Vance or a line of armed bounty hunters, but a single, older man wrapped in a heavy buffalo robe. His face was weathered like old boot leather, his whiskers frosted white by the mountain air, and his eyes carried the sharp, direct look of a man who had spent his life dealing in commerce rather than conflict. This was Miller, the primary merchant from the settlement below, and the owner of the heavy freight wagons that hauled Silas's ironwork to the railhead. He looked past Silas, his gaze locking directly onto Elara's towering, muscular form with an expression that was entirely devoid of warmth. Miller did not step into the cabin. He stood in the crisp air, his boots caking the clean porch with gray slush as he spoke, his voice a dry, rattling whisper that carried clearly in the quiet morning. He stated that the entire settlement was talking about the gold Silas had thrown down at the Black Bear Tavern, and that Vance had already filed a formal claim with the territorial judge for the return of the railroad company property. He looked at Silas, his jaw hardening under his frosted beard, as he added that a man who harbored a fugitive could not expect to hold the town's contract for the spring freight iron. Silas did not lower the rifle, though he kept the muzzle pointed toward the floorboards. His broad chest expanded with a deep, slow breath that made the leather of his apron creak. The silver scar on his cheekbone pulsed slightly against his dark beard, the only sign of the anger bubbling beneath his stoic exterior. He stated that his iron was the truest in the territory, and that a contract bought with honest sweat had nothing to do with what a man did under his own roof. Miller sneered, a cold, dismissive gesture that made Elara's fingers curl into powerful fists inside her pockets. The merchant remarked that the law did not care about the quality of a man's forge when he was hiding a runaway who belonged to the people who paid for the tracks. He pointed a thick, gloved finger at Elara, stating that if she was still on this mountain by the time the supply wagons rolled next Tuesday, Silas would find his forge cold and his credit cancelled at every dry goods store from here to the Missouri. He turned without waiting for a reply, his heavy boots crunching back down the shoveled path toward his horse. The heavy door clicked shut as Silas pulled it to, the latch falling into place with a sound that felt as final as a gunshot. The silence that followed was dense, suffocating, and charged with a sudden, devastating shift in their relationship dynamic. Elara stood frozen in the center of the room, her amber eyes staring at the grain of the wood in the floor. The fragile sense of safety that had begun to bloom in her chest over the last few days shivered and cracked like thin ice. She realized that her presence was no longer just an inconvenience or a temporary burden. She was actively destroying the livelihood of the only man who had ever treated her with dignity. She pulled her heavy wool coat tighter around her broad shoulders, her jaw setting into a hard, painful line as she made her decision. She looked up at Silas, her voice dropping into a low, steady murmur that carried the full weight of her resolve. She stated that she would not be the cause of a good man losing his fire, and that she would pack her things and leave for the northern timber. Before the sun reached the middle of the sky, Silas turned around slowly, his massive frame seeming to fill the entire space between the table and the hearth. He did not look angry at Miller's threats, nor did he look panicked by the choice before them. He walked over to her with his slow, deliberate stride, stopping just inches from where she stood. The proximity between them was intense, their matched physical size creating a strange, private world in the middle of the cabin. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering near her elbow for a brief second before he let it drop, his gray eyes shining with an intense, protective fire that made her breath hitch in her throat. He stated that a man who extinguished his own forge to save a few pieces of silver was no man at all, and that his contract with Miller was nothing compared to the peace he had found since she walked through his door. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble that shook the very air in her lungs, delivering an emotional revelation that shattered her assumptions about his motives. He was not protecting her out of simple charity or a lingering sense of military duty. He was doing it because her presence had given his isolated, scarred existence a meaning it had lacked for years. The exposed truth left Elara feeling raw, vulnerable, and profoundly connected to the giant before her. The original understanding of their arrangement, a temporary sanctuary until the trails opened, was completely gone, replaced by a deep, mutual dependence that terrified them both. They were no longer an outcast woman and a solitary blacksmith. They were two partners bound together against a world that wanted to reduce them to property and profit. Silas moved past her to the stove, lifting the heavy iron lid to stir the cornmeal mush, his movements regaining their habitual, comforting rhythm. He murmured that a heavy heart made for a poor appetite, and that they had a long day of work ahead of them if they wanted to ready the forge for the winter iron. Elara sat down at the table, her large hands resting on the smooth wood, her heart pounding with a mixture of intense relief and a new, escalating fear. Silas had chosen her over his livelihood, but the stakes had just been raised to a level that threatened to destroy them both. As she took the tin mug of coffee he handed her, she could not shake the image of Miller's cold, calculating eyes. Tuesday was only 4 days away, and she knew that, when the supply wagons arrived, they would not be filled with flour and salt pork, but with men who carried the authority to tear this sanctuary apart piece by piece. The heavy iron door of the blacksmith forge swung open with a rusty shriek, letting in a blast of freezing mountain air that caused the orange embers of the hearth to dance furiously. Inside, the heat was intense, smelling of coal smoke, melted slag, and the sharp, clean scent of heated metal. Silas stood over the anvil, his massive leather apron blackened by soot, his bare, heavily muscled arms gleaming with sweat despite the winter chill pressing against the open door. He swung his heavy 4-pound cross-peen hammer with fluid, tireless precision, each blow striking the orange bar of steel with a ringing, metallic crack that echoed off the high stone bluff outside. Elara stood on the opposite side of the forge, her towering frame casting a long shadow across the dirt floor. She held the heavy iron tongs, her powerful biceps tensing as she stabilized the white-hot metal against the anvil, her amber eyes reflecting the brilliant glow of the iron. They had been working since the first light of dawn, preparing the heavy tire iron and horseshoe stock for the local ranchers before Miller's deadline could seal the town against them. There was no need for conversation between them. Their shared physical power had found a perfect, silent rhythm. Every time Silas raised his massive hammer, Elara adjusted the angle of the steel with a subtle, expert flick of her wrist, her grip as unyielding as a mechanical vice. Silas's gray eyes tracked her movements, a deep, wordless admiration shining through the layer of coal dust that blackened his scarred face. For the first time in his isolated life, he had found someone who did not simply watch him labor, but who could stand beside him in the heat of the fire and match his immense strength blow for blow. The peaceful harmony of their labor shivered and broke without warning. A sharp, panicked snort came from the lean-to-shed outside where Silas kept his mule. A second later, the heavy, crunching sound of multiple boots breaking through the frozen snow crust signaled that Miller's deadline had been anticipated. Silas dropped his hammer onto the anvil with a dull, clanging thud. His massive frame went rigid, his jaw clenching so hard that the silver scar on his cheekbone turned a stark, bloodless white. He did not look at the door. He looked directly at Elara. His winter-gray eyes filled with a sudden, protective ferocity that made her chest tighten. He murmured that she should step behind the brick chimney where the masonry was thickest, and that she must not show her face until he called for her. His voice was a low, guttural vibration that carried the absolute gravity of a man who knew the cost of a bullet. Elara did not move toward the chimney. She set the heavy iron tongs down on the cooling steel bar, her towering shoulders squaring as her amber eyes locked onto the open doorway of the forge. Her broad chest expanded with a deep, resolute breath, her muscular forearms corded with tension beneath her rolled canvas sleeves. She stated that a woman who shared the heat of the fire did not hide in the ash when the wind blew cold, and that she had not learned to use her strength just to watch him take a blow on her account. She reached down, her large, calloused hand wrapping around the smooth hickory handle of a heavy sledgehammer, leaning against the coal bin, lifting the massive tool as if it weighed no more than a willow branch. Silas looked at her, his expression shifting from protective alarm to a profound, blazing pride that seemed to light up his dark features more than the forge fire. He did not argue with her. He simply drew his long, heavy hunting knife from his utility belt, his massive biceps swelling as he adjusted his stance to face the open door. 3 men strode into the clearing before the forge, their heavy winter coats encrusted with dry white frost. Vance led them, his hawkish face twisted into a cruel, triumphant sneer, a long-barreled Colt revolver held firmly in his gloved hand. Behind him stood 2 lean, rough-looking individuals carrying heavy wooden clubs and iron-binding chains, their dark eyes scanning the interior of the forge with a predatory eagerness. Vance did not stop at the threshold. He stepped directly onto the dirt floor, his boots kicking up the black coal dust as he raised his pistol. aiming the cold iron barrel directly at Silas's broad chest. He stated that the territorial judge had signed the warrant, and that any man who stood between a bounty hunter and company property would find himself buried beneath the mountain drifts before sundown. Silas took a single, massive step forward, completely unbothered by the muzzle of the revolver pointed at his heart. His presence was overwhelming, a towering wall of muscle and scarred determination that seemed to shrink the interior of the forge. He stated that a piece of paper signed by a corrupt judge did not carry the weight of a man's home, and that Vance would have to use every bullet in his cylinder before he laid a finger on the woman who belonged under this roof. Vance's eyes narrowed into venomous slits. He did not give a command. He simply stepped back and signaled his 2 men to advance. The first man lunged forward, swinging his heavy wooden club toward Silas's head with an ugly, whistling sound. Silas ducked beneath the blow with surprising agility for his massive size, his left fist driving into the man's ribs with the force of a hydraulic piston. The sound of cracking bone echoed through the forge, and the man collapsed into the coal bin with a choked groan. At the exact same moment, the second bounty hunter rushed toward Elara, his iron binding chains rattling as he sought to loop them around her powerful wrists. He underestimated her sheer, raw physical dominance. Elara did not flinch or retreat. She brought the heavy sledgehammer around in a short, ferocious arc, striking the iron chains out of his hands with a shattering impact that sent sparks flying against the stone walls. Before the man could recover his balance, she stepped into his space, her towering frame dwarfing him completely. She gripped the front of his heavy wool coat with both hands, her massive biceps bunching as she lifted him clean off his feet and hurled him through the open door of the forge. The man hit the frozen snowbank outside with a dull thud, tumbling into the drifts where he lay motionless, his breath knocked completely from his lungs. Vance watched his men fall in a matter of seconds, his face turning a sickly, panicked white as he realized his numbers meant nothing against the sheer physical power of the 2 outcasts. He swung his revolver back toward Elara, his fingers tightening on the trigger in a desperate attempt to salvage his prize. Silas moved like a striking snake. He did not look at his own safety. He threw his massive, scarred body directly between Vance and Elara, his broad back absorbing a brutal blow from Vance's heavy pistol whip as the gun discharged harmlessly into the rafters. The impact tore a deep, jagged gash across Silas's shoulder, the dark crimson blood instantly soaking through his thermal shirt. Elara let out a raw, primitive roar of protective fury as she saw Silas bleed. She dropped the sledgehammer, stepped forward with terrifying speed, and clamped her large, muscular hand around Vance's wrist, twisting the bones until the revolver clattered harmlessly onto the dirt floor. She threw him back with a single, powerful shove that sent him sprawling into the freezing mire outside the clearing. Vance scrambled to his feet, his face twisted in a mixture of terror and agonizing pain as he cradled his broken wrist. He looked at the 2 giants standing at the threshold of the forge, Silas, bleeding but unyielding, and Elara, her amber eyes blazing with an untamed, lethal protective fire. Vance realized that another step into that clearing would be his last. He turned and fled down the mountain trail, his 2 injured men dragging themselves through the snow behind him until the dark timber swallowed them whole. The clearing fell into a sudden, heavy silence, broken only by the sharp, ragged pants of their breathing. Elara turned to Silas, her amber eyes instantly filling with an intense, agonizing panic as she saw the dark blood pooling on his massive shoulder. The man who had been her rock, her unyielding shield against the world, was wounded because of her presence, and the sight tore through her chest with a pain that was far worse than any chain she had ever worn. The wind outside the forge died down to a breathless, freezing whisper, leaving the mountain clearing trapped in a stark, silent isolation. Inside, the heat from the forge stove still cast a fierce, orange glow across the dirt floor, but the rhythmic comfort of their shared labor was entirely gone. Silas leaned heavily against the log door frame, his massive right arm pressed against the timber to steady his towering frame. His breathing came in deep, ragged hollows that shook his broad chest. His winter-gray eyes clouded with a dull, throbbing pain. The dark crimson blood from the pistol whip had soaked completely through his thermal shirt, creating a wide, glistening stain that dripped slowly onto his black leather apron. Elara stepped across the forge, her heavy boots moving with a frantic, desperate speed she had never used before. Her towering, muscular frame trembled with a raw, agonizing panic that made her throat close up. She did not look at the broken chains or the discarded clubs on the floor. She reached out, her large, calloused hands hovering over his uninjured shoulder, her touch lighter than a feather, as she gently guided his massive frame toward the small wooden stool near the coal bin. She murmured that he must sit down before the blood drain took his legs, and that she had never wanted his blood on her account. Her voice was no longer a firm, defensive shield. It was a rough, broken whisper that vibrated with intense emotional dependence. Silas allowed himself to sink onto the sturdy stool, his massive knees nearly reaching his chin as he lowered his head. He let out a long, shuddering groan that he tried to choke back behind his dark beard, his large fingers curling into the fabric of his trousers to anchor himself against the dizziness. He did not look up at his shoulder, nor did he look at the blood on his apron. He kept his gray eyes fixed on Elara's face, watching the tears of terror that were beginning to trace clean lines through the coal dust on her cheeks. He muttered that a scratch from a coward's iron did not have the power to break a blacksmith, and that he would take 100 such blows before he let a man lay a hand on her. The fierce loyalty in his low, gravelly voice tore through Elara's chest with a pain that was sharper than any blade. She did not answer him with words. She moved around the forge with a frantic, purposeful efficiency, gathering a clean linen rag from the tool chest and a tin cup of fresh water from the wash bucket. She knelt in the black dirt before him, her towering height still bringing her amber eyes level with his broad chest even while she was on her knees. Fashiz reached out, her large, muscular fingers working with an incredible, trembling tenderness as she began to peel the blood-stiffened fabric of his shirt away from the wound. The skin on his shoulder was thick and corded with heavy muscle, but the pistol whip had left a deep, jagged gash that wept dark crimson across his silver-scarred skin. Elara dipped the linen rag into the water, her hands steadying as the old instincts of survival took over. She pressed the cloth against the torn flesh, her thumb gently wiping away the blood that threatened to obscure the damage. Silas went perfectly rigid under her touch, his massive chest expanding as he took a deep, whistling breath through his teeth to ride out the intense sting of the water. He did not pull away from her. He rested his large, calloused hand on the top of her shoulder, his fingers digging slightly into her thick muscle, not in violence, but to find an anchor in the storm of pain. The physical contact between them was electric, a raw, unshielded proximity that stripped away the last remnants of their emotional distance. They were two giants, physically matched and emotionally scarred, bound together in the quiet center of a violent world. As the cool water began to soothe the heat in his flesh, Silas's grip on her shoulder relaxed, his large hand smoothing the canvas of her shirt with a slow, rhythmic movement that felt remarkably like a caress. He looked down at her face, observing the intense, focused concentration in her amber eyes and the hard, protective set of her heavy jaw. He let out a long, slow sigh, his voice dropping into a quiet, reflective register that carried the full weight of his hidden grief. He stated that he had spent 3 years of the war watching good people break under the iron, because he was not strong enough or fast enough to stand between them and the fire, and that when he saw Vance raise that pistol toward her, his own skin had felt like nothing compared to the thought of losing her. The emotional disclosure hung in the thick air of the forge, more powerful and transforming than the heat of the hearth. Elara paused her hands, the bloody linen rag still pressed against his skin, her amber eyes rising to lock onto his stormy gray gaze. The core loop of his isolations was finally laid bare. His protective stoicism was not a shield against her, but a monument to the guilt he carried for the people he could not save during his years of service. She felt a sudden, profound rush of empathy that washed away the last traces of her own defensive armor. She realized that by allowing him to protect her, she was not just finding a sanctuary for herself. She was providing him with a chance to heal the old wounds that had hollowed out his soul. She leaned forward slightly, her broad forehead almost touching his scarred temple, her breathing synchronizing with his own deep, steady rhythm. She murmured that a man who carried the weight of the dead could never build a home for the living, and that he had already paid his debt to the mountain by giving her back her name. Her large hand moved from his wound to his cheek, her calloused fingers gently tracing the silver line of the scar that cut through his beard, a healing gesture that created an intense, breathless intimacy between them. Silas closed his eyes at the touch, his massive frame shaking with a single, silent sob that he could not contain. He turned his head into her palm, his dark beard brushing against her skin as he accepted the comfort she offered, his old guilt finally beginning to dissolve under the heat of her absolute acceptance. Standing, they stayed in that quiet posture for several minutes, the forge fire slowly burning down to a bed of quiet red coals behind them. The physical danger of Vance and Miller still loomed over the valley, but inside the smoky logs, an unbreakable emotional safety had been forged between the two outcasts. When Elara finally stood up to help him back toward the cabin, Silas rose with her, his massive frame steady once again, his gray eyes clear and filled with a new, quiet purpose. He looked down at her towering, muscular form, his hand remaining locked in hers as they stepped out into the blinding white light of the snow. But as they walked toward the house, Elara felt a cold, lingering dread settle back into her veins. Silas had found his purpose in protecting her, but she knew that the territorial law would not be satisfied by a broken bounty hunter, and she wondered how much more blood would have to be spilled before they could truly call this mountain their own. The winter sun hung low over the western ridge, painting the vast snowfields of the canyon in long, bruised strokes of violet and gold. Inside the cabin, a dense, heavy quiet had settled into the corners of the room, replacing the frantic energy of the morning confrontation. Silas sat on the low oak bench by the window, his massive frame hunched forward as the fading light caught the pale skin of his bare torso. Elara stood just behind him, her towering, muscular silhouette nearly blocking the light from the hearth. She was working with slow, deliberate care, her large hands smoothing a fresh layer of the green pine resin salve over the jagged tear on his shoulder. Her calloused fingers were hyper-aware of the thick, iron-hard muscle beneath his skin, and every time his chest expanded with a deep breath, she felt a strange, intoxicating tremor of longing ripple through her own powerful forearms. She wished she could pull him closer, to bury her face in the thick wool of his dark beard and tell him that his presence was the only anchor she had ever known in a life of drifting. But the old, stubborn defenses she had built over a lifetime of hardship refused to release their hold. She kept her jaw set, her amber eyes fixed entirely on the wound as she worked. She was a giant of a woman, built for labor and endurance, and she did not know how to ask for tenderness without feeling as though she were begging for a scrap of bread. Silas remained perfectly still, under the touch of her hands. His head lowered as he watched the shadow of her broad shoulders stretch across the floorboards. He could feel the heat radiating from her towering frame. A powerful, comforting presence that made the throbbing ache in his shoulder seem entirely insignificant. He wanted to reach back, to wrap his massive, scarred arms around her waist and hold her against his chest until the world outside vanished completely. But the lingering ghost of his old guilt, the memory of the family he had failed to save during the long, bloody years of the war, whispered that he was a dangerous man to love. He believed that his sanctuary was cursed, and that any creature who sought shelter beneath his roof would eventually be consumed by the violence that followed him. Like a hound, he adjusted his position slightly, his massive thigh muscle tensing beneath his denim trousers as he let out a long, slow sigh. He did not look back at her, but his voice dropped into a low, gravelly vibration that filled the quiet room. He muttered that the wind was turning toward the north again, and that the trail down to the valley would be completely blocked by fresh drifts before the morning star rose. Elara paused her hand, her fingers resting lightly against the smooth silver scar on his temple. A sudden, sharp prickle of jealousy flared in her chest, not for another person, but for the very mountains that allowed him to remain so isolated, so unreachable behind his wall of stoic silence. She stated that a trail that stayed closed forever was nothing but a dead end, and that a man who spent his whole life waiting for the next storm would never see the spring bloom. She pulled her hand back, her voice carrying a rare, vulnerable edge that made Silas's broad shoulders tighten. Silas stood up slowly, his towering height bringing his winter-gray eyes level with hers in the dimming light of the cabin. The physical proximity between them was intense, their massive chests nearly brushing against each other as they stood in the narrow space between the bench and the hearth. He looked into her amber eyes, his expression a mixture of profound longing and a deep, agonizing restraint that made his jaw muscles clench. He stated that the spring always brought the mud, and that the mud revealed every track a person had tried to hide in the winter white. He reached for his heavy thermal shirt, slipping his thick arms into the sleeves with a slow, painful movement that made the silver scar on his cheek whiten with exertion. The emotional distance between them seemed to widen even as their bodies remained so close. They were hyper-aware of each other's physical power, yet both were terrified to take the final step that would bridge the gap between their lonely existences. Elara turned away, her heavy boots clacking softly against the floorboards as she moved toward the small kitchen table to gather the supper dishes. She felt a deep, aching dependence on this scarred veteran that frightened her far more than Vance's bounty hunters or Miller's threats. She knew that if she lost this cabin, if she lost the quiet safety of his presence, she would be nothing more than a wild animal running through the timber until her strength finally gave out. The evening passed in a tense, watchful silence, the crimson glow of the wood stove throwing long, dancing shadows across the log walls. Silas took his place on the floor, by the hearth, his heavy wool blanket wrapped around his massive shoulders. As he leaned back against the timber, he did not close his eyes. He kept his gaze fixed on the small glass window, his large hands resting heavily on his knees as he listened to the low, mournful howling of the wind through the high pines. Elara lay beneath the hand-woven quilts in the far corner, her long, muscular limbs twisted in the fabric as she stared at the dark ceiling beams. She could hear the deep, rhythmic sound of Silas's breathing across the room, a comforting counterpoint to the storm. But her heart remained unsettled. She knew that the relative peace of the mountain was an illusion. Vance had been broken, but a man like that would not forget the humiliation of being handled like a child by a woman. He would return, and next time, he would not bring clubs and chains. He would bring the full, crushing weight of the territorial law, and she wondered if even Silas's mountain could withstand such a storm. The dawn broke cold and clear, the pale light sliding over the snow crust like spilled silver. Inside the cabin, the morning chill was sharp enough to make a person's breath smoke before the stove caught the wood. Silas was already on his feet, his massive leather apron tied tightly over his fresh thermal shirt, the dark stain from yesterday's blood hidden beneath the heavy hide. His movements were slower than usual, his broad chest rising and falling with a deliberate caution as he lifted a heavy iron skillet onto the black stovetop. Elara stepped out of the bed, her towering frame casting a wide shadow across the floorboards. She adjusted the collar of her patched canvas shirt, her amber eyes tracking the subtle, protective slant of his broad shoulders. The intimacy of tending his wound the night before still hummed in her blood, creating a profound, aching emotional safety that made her long to stay within these log walls forever. The quiet of the meadow was shattered by the rhythmic, heavy crunching of many horses plowing through the deep drifts down by the creek bed. Silas went motionless, his large hand freezing on the handle of the coffee pot. His gray eyes hardened into flint as he looked toward the rifle leaning against the wall. But he did not reach for it immediately. He looked at Elara, his jaw clenching so hard that the silver scar on his cheekbone white out against his dark beard. He murmured that the trouble had returned early, and that she must stay near the back window where the log casing was double thick. His voice was a low, protective rumble that carried an immense weight of sacrificial love. Elara did not retreat. She stepped up beside him, her towering, muscular frame squaring against the light from the door, her amber eyes blazing with an absolute, unyielding loyalty. She stated that she had not survived the winter just to watch him take another bullet for her, and that, if the world was coming to take her back, they would have to pull both of them out of the clearing together. Silas hauled the heavy oak door open, stepping out onto the frost-rimed porch. Standing in the snowbank was not Vance or a line of dirty bounty hunters, but the territorial marshal himself, flanked by 4 heavily armed deputies and Miller, the merchant. The marshal was a tall, gray-bearded veteran with a hard, uncompromising face who wore a silver star pinned to his heavy wool coat. He looked at Silas, then up at Elara's massive, imposing figure standing right behind him on the boards. Miller stepped forward, his boots churning the clean snow into a gray mire. He pointed a gloved finger at Silas, his dry voice rattling through the cold air. He stated that the blacksmith had violated the territorial code by harboring an escaped railroad laborer, and that he had formally canceled Silas's contract for the spring freight iron. He added that every merchant from the valley to the railhead had agreed to strike Silas from their ledgers, and that he would find himself without a single ounce of coal or grain before the winter was out if he did not surrender the woman immediately. The sacrifice Silas was being asked to make was total. He was being asked to give up his livelihood, his position in the territory, and the peaceful life he had spent years building after the war, all for a woman he had rescued from an auction block just days before. Silas did not blink. He took a single, massive step forward, his giant frame completely shielding Elara from the deputy's cold gazes. The muscles in his bare, corded arms tensed until they looked as solid as the iron anvil behind him. He stated that his forge belonged to him, not to the railroad company, and that he would rather burn his tools and live on wild game than sell his dignity to a pack of thieves who traded in human flesh. His voice was a deep, resonant roar that shook the frost from the pine branches, revealing a fierce and sacrificial love that required no verbal declarations to carry its weight. The marshal looked at Silas's scarred face, then at the deep, dark bloodstain that had begun to seep through his shirt from yesterday's injury. The lawman let out a long, slow breath that rose like a cloud of white smoke between them. He looked back at Miller, his voice dropping into a hard, professional register. He stated that the territorial judge had indeed signed a property warrant, but that the law did not allow a merchant to starve a war veteran out of his own home over a disputed labor contract. He looked up at Silas again, his gray eyes softening with a quiet, mutual understanding born of shared service in the old campaigns. He muttered that he would hold the warrant until Tuesday noon to allow the blacksmith to file an appeal with the circuit court, but that if the paperwork was not in order by then, his deputies would be forced to clear the cabin by the book. The riders turned their horses around, plowing back down the steep trail toward the valley until the dark timber swallowed the sound of their hooves. The door clicked shut as Silas pulled it to, the heavy iron bolts sliding into place with a hollow, metallic thud. The silence that followed was dense, heavy, and filled with the terrifying reality of their situation. Silas had chosen Elara over everything he owned, but the countdown had begun, and they both knew that Tuesday noon was a wall they could not climb with muscle alone. Elara looked at his massive, bleeding shoulder, her heart pounding with a fierce, protective longing that made her hands tremble. She had found a man who would sacrifice the world to keep her safe, but the cost of his loyalty was a weight that was beginning to threaten to crush them both before the spring could even arrive. The log walls of the cabin seemed to hold the cold brilliance of the late morning sun, casting deep, clear shadows across the plank floor. Silas sat at the heavy oak table, his large head bowed over a piece of grease-stained paper as he cleaned the delicate mechanisms of his hunting knife. His massive shoulders were slightly sloped, the thick canvas of his shirt taut against the bulky dressing that covered his wounded shoulder. Elara stood by the small, hand-hewn pantry in the corner, her towering frame reaching easily to the highest shelves as she searched for a basket to carry out into the frozen timber. Her amber eyes kept drifting back to his silent figure, her heart aching with a profound, unshielded trust that had grown too large for her to carry in secret. She needed to understand the depth of the man who had traded his entire future for her freedom. She walked to the small storage trunk near the woodpile, searching for a clean piece of flannel to use as a rag for the forge. Her large, calloused fingers brushed against a heavy, leather-bound folder hidden beneath a stack of old winter blankets. When she pulled it free, a folded, yellowed document slipped from the parchment pages, its edges frayed and smelling deeply of old paper and dried river mud. It was a formal military citation from the Territorial Volunteer Infantry, dated 5 years prior. Elara held the paper in her large hands, her amber eyes scanning the faded ink. The document detailed a brutal winter siege in the northern foothills, describing how a giant private named Silas had carried 3 wounded comrades out of a burning timber redoubt while under heavy enemy fire, despite sustaining a severe facial wound from a shattered piece of iron. The text spoke of absolute, selfless bravery, but what struck Elara most was a short, hand-written note on the back, penned in Silas's own blocky, Uneven script, the fire took the house anyway. None of the names came home. A profound, suffocating understanding rushed through her veins, answering the core loop of mystery that had surrounded his isolation since the night at the tavern. His legendary stoicism was not a shield against the world. It was a monument to the crushing grief of a man who believed that his strength was a curse because it only allowed him to survive, while everyone he loved was consumed by the flame. Elara walked slowly toward the table, her heavy leather boots making no sound against the braided rug. She placed the yellowed paper gently onto the oak surface, right beside his large hand. Silas went perfectly still, his winter-gray eyes locking onto the document before rising to meet her gaze, his features hardening into a defensive, stony mask that made the silver scar on his cheek whiten with tension. Elara did not flinch from his guarded look. She sat down on the bench opposite him, her broad shoulders squaring as she leaned forward, her chest nearly touching the edge of the table. She pulled her thick, dark hair back, her voice dropping into a rich, lyrical register that seemed to fill the quiet cabin with a deep, healing warmth. She stated that a man who carried a cemetery in his head would always find a ghost in his forge, and that it was time he let the dead sleep so the living could find a place to stand. She reached across the wood, her large, muscular hand covering his calloused fingers, her touch firm, warm, and entirely steady. Silas looked down at her hand, his thick bicep trembling slightly under the pressure of her fingers. The hard, defensive lines of his face began to fracture, his gray eyes softening with a quiet, devastating vulnerability that stripped away his habitual restraint. He let out a long, shuddering breath that shook his massive chest, his voice a low, broken murmur as he admitted that he had built this cabin to be a tomb for his memories, but that from the moment she had looked up at him from that tavern table, the logs had felt like a home again. The absolute honesty of his disclosure allowed the final wall of her own defensive armor to dissolve completely. Elara tightened her grip on his hand, her amber eyes shining with a fierce, beautiful clarity as she finally shared the full, horrific truth of her own past. She described the brutal labor boss who had purchased her family's debt in the East, the endless, bone-crushing toil of the rail camps where her immense strength had been used until her spirit was raw, and the desperate, bloody night she had broken her own chains to run into the winter timber. She allowed him to see her not just as a powerful survivor or a fugitive to be protected, but as a whole human being who had survived the same fires that had marked his own flesh. The profound trust between them became an absolute, unyielding sanctuary, a bond forged in the heat of their shared trauma and cemented by their matched physical power. They were no longer two outcasts hiding from the law. They were a single, unbreakable front, ready to face whatever consequence the valley might send up the trail. Silas rose to his feet, his towering frame restoring the natural grandeur of the room. He did not let go of her hand. He lifted it to his lips, his dark beard brushing against her calloused knuckles, with a gesture of profound respect that made her breath catch in her throat. He murmured that the circuit judge would have to bring an army to clear this meadow, because the iron they had forged together was stronger than any contract written on paper. They spent the remainder of the afternoon preparing the cabin for a long siege, stacking the split oak logs high against the windows and securing the livestock inside the heavy lean-to. Their movements were coordinated, fluid, and filled with a quiet, resolute confidence that carried no trace of the morning's panic. Yet, as the twilight began to purple the snow drifts outside, a sudden, sharp rapping at the back shutters made them both go rigid. It was a soft, erratic signal, completely different from the heavy boots of Vance or the marshal, and Elara felt a sudden, cold dread grip her stomach as she realized that the countdown to Tuesday noon had just been interrupted by a shadow they had never anticipated. The muffled, frantic scraping against the heavy pine shutter died away, leaving only the low, mournful sigh of the wind gathering in the high canyons. Silas moved across the floor with the silent grace of a predatory cat, his massive frame low, his uninjured right hand instantly gripping the worn walnut stock of his rifle. Elara stayed half a step behind him, her towering form squared, her breath coming in slow, disciplined measures that did not rattle her broad chest. She reached down, her powerful fingers closing around the iron handle of the heavy blacksmith tongs she had brought from the forge. Her amber eyes remained fixed on the narrow seam of the window where the frost had begun to thick-coat the wood. Silas did not shout a warning. He threw the wooden latch back with a swift, powerful jerk of his thumb, forcing the heavy cedar shutter inward. A small, shivering figure collapsed over the sill, tumbling onto the rough cabin floorboards in a heap of frayed wool and frozen mud. It was a young boy from the settlement below, no older than 12, his face white with a dangerous, icy numbness and his lips turned the color of bruised plums. He gasped for air, his tiny chest heaving beneath a threadbare coat that was entirely inadequate for the mountain winter. He looked up at Silas's scarred, imposing face, his voice cracking into a terrified, breathless sob as he delivered his message. He stammered that Miller had not waited for the Tuesday deadline, and that the merchant had hired 3 more ruthless regulators from the southern railhead to reinforce Vance's men. They were already moving up the old logging trail with heavy torches and kerosene cans, intending to burn the blacksmith out before the marshal could return to enforce the stay. The boy fainted from the sheer exhaustion of his run, his small head rolling against Silas's heavy work boots. Elara knelt instantly, her massive, muscular thighs flexing as she gathered the small child into her arms with an incredible, instinctive tenderness. She carried him to the hearth, wrapping him in the hand-woven lavender quilts from the bed, her large hand smoothing the damp hair from his frozen forehead. But even as she performed the warmth beats of comfort, a devastating, hollow despair settled into her chest, heavier than any iron chain she had ever worn. She looked up at Silas, who stood by the window, his winter-gray eyes reflecting the cold, pale light of the stars. She realized that the trap had finally sprung. If they stayed and fought, the cabin would become a pyre, and the innocent boy, who had risked his life to warn them, would burn alongside them. If they fled into the deeper drifts, Silas would lose his home, his forge, and everything his ancestors had built on this mountain. She stood up slowly, her towering height bringing her level with his broad chest, her jaw setting into a hard, painful line of absolute sacrifice. She stated that the fire was coming for her, not for him, and that she would walk down the logging trail, alone, to meet Vance's men before they could reach the meadow. Silas turned his head slowly, the silver scar on his cheekbone pulsing white in the darkness. He did not look angry, he looked entirely ancient, his features settling into an expression of absolute, unyielding stone that made her breath catch in her throat. He walked over to her with his slow, heavy deliberation, his massive boots thudding against the floor. He did not reach for her, roughly. He placed his large, calloused hands on both of her broad shoulders, his grip so firm and grounded that it seemed to anchor her to the very mountain beneath them. He murmured that a man who ran from his own hearth was already dead, and that he had not spent his life learning to master the iron, just to watch the only beautiful thing he had ever found be consumed by a coward's flame. His voice carried a deep, agonizing restraint that made Elara's eyes burn with unshed tears. She could feel the intense, electric longing vibrating between their massive frames, a near confession of the love they were both too terrified to speak aloud, while the shadow of death hung over their clearing. She reached up, her large hand covering his wrist, her voice dropping into a rough, desperate whisper as she begged him to see reason. She stated that she could not live with the knowledge that his blood had paid for her safety a second time. Silas did not answer her with words. He let his hands slide from her shoulders down to her wrists, his thumb gently brushing against the healing purple welts left by the tavern ropes. He gave her a single, solemn nod that carried the weight of a final vow. He turned toward the storage trunk, lifting his heavy leather apron and buckling it over his chest like armor, his massive biceps swelling as he prepared for the final, brutal confrontation. He stepped toward the heavy oak door, his rifle held ready in his right hand, his towering figure blocking out the light from the fire as he prepared to face the trail alone. He told her to keep the boy near the hearth and to bar the door from the inside until the smoke cleared from the clearing. Elara stood in the center of the room, her fingers curling into powerful fists as the heavy timber door clicked shut behind him, the iron bolt remaining unslid in her hand. She was trapped in an agonizing vortex of emotional separation, her mind twisting with the horrific realization that he was walking into a massacre to save her dignity. And she knew that if she stayed behind that wall, she would lose him forever before they could even find the courage to say the words that would bind them together. The iron bolt remained cold and heavy in Elara's hand, its weight a physical manifestation of the choice that threatened to tear her soul apart. Outside, the night was a vast, unyielding expanse of black and white, the silence so absolute that she could hear the distant, rhythmic crunch of Silas's heavy boots fading toward the narrow logging trail. Inside, the small boy sighed beneath the hand-woven lavender quilts, his breathing finally deep and steady as the warmth of the hickory fire worked its way into his small bones. Elara looked from the child to the heavy oak door, her broad chest heaving with a sudden, suffocating realization. She was a giant, built with muscle and sinew that matched the mountains themselves, and she had spent her life running from people who treated her like a beast of burden. Silas had not just given her shelter, he had given her her humanity. She could not stay behind the timber while he bled. She dropped the iron bolt, the heavy bar clattering against the floorboards with a dull, echoing thud. She did not pack a bag. She did not grab a coat. She moved toward the kitchen table, her amber eyes catching a glint of metal near the woodpile where Silas kept his extra tools. There, resting on a block of raw oak, was a small, hand-forged branding iron. Silas had spent the quiet hours of the previous afternoon working on it in secret, his massive hands moving with a delicate precision that had puzzled her at the time. Elara picked up the heavy tool, her large fingers wrapping around the cool iron handle. She turned it over in the firelight, her breath catching violently in her throat as she read the reversed letters carved into the face of the metal. Silas had not forged a ranch brand or a manufacturer's mark. He had carved her name, Elara. Beneath it, in deep, blocky characters that would stay forever in the wood or the iron, he had added two simple words, belongs here. The core loop of her deep, agonizing question of self-worth was resolved in a single, shattering heartbeat. The branding iron was not a mark of ownership. It was a confession of absolute belonging. Silas had not bought her from the Tavern Block to be a servant or a piece of property. He had recognized her as the missing piece of his own fractured existence. He had carved her name into the very metal of his life before he had even found the courage to speak his love aloud. A profound, unstoppable wave of emotional safety and protective fury rushed through her veins, erasing the last lingering traces of her lifelong fear. She realized that his choice to face Vance's regulators alone was not a rejection of her strength, but a desperate effort, misguided attempt to keep her pristine, to keep her from having to spill more blood to maintain her freedom. He was ready to die to preserve the sanctuary he had built for her name. Elara threw the heavy oak door open, stepping out into the freezing night air, without a single thought for the cold. The winter wind whipped through her canvas shirt, but her skin felt like burning iron. She did not take the smooth, shoveled path. She plunged directly into the 3-foot drifts, her massive thighs and powerful calves tearing through the crust of the snow with a ferocious, unstoppable momentum that ignored the resistance of the mountain. She followed the deep, wide tracks left by Silas's boots, her amber eyes blazing in the darkness like twin lanterns. She reached the throat of the canyon just as the first orange glare of a kerosene torch flickered through the dark pines. Silas stood in the middle of the narrow trail, his massive frame blocking the path like an ancient granite bluff. His rifle was raised, his winter-gray eyes fixed on the 5 men who stepped out of the timber. Vance was there, his broken wrist wrapped in a crude leather splint, his face twisted into an ugly, venomous grin as his regulators advanced with heavy clubs and burning torches. The regulators did not look like lawmen. They were hard, lean mercenaries from the rail lines, their eyes reflecting the dancing fire of the pine knots they carried. Vance shouted that the blacksmith was alone, and that a single rifle could not stop 5 torches when the wind was blowing toward the cabin. Silas did not retreat a single inch. His broad chest expanded with a deep, resolute breath, his massive bicep tensing against the walnut stock of his weapon. He stated that the mountain did not belong to the railroad, and that every man who stepped into this clearing would find his name written in the snow before the fire could touch a single shingle of his roof. His voice was a low, dangerous growl that carried the absolute certainty of a man who had already accepted his own end, before Vance could give the order to advance. A massive, towering silhouette broke through the tree line behind Silas. Elara stepped onto the trail, her immense physical presence instantly altering the dynamic of the clearing. She did not carry a weapon. She carried only the raw, terrifying power of her own heavily muscled frame, her broad shoulders squared and her jaw set like winter iron. She did not stay behind him. She stepped up right beside Silas, her long, corded arm reaching out to press down on the barrel of his rifle, lowering the weapon until it pointed at the snow. Silas turned his head, his gray eyes wide with a sudden, agonizing panic as he saw her standing in the firelight. He muttered that she had broken the bar, and that she was supposed to stay with the child, where the wood was thick. Elara looked directly into his scarred face, her amber eyes shining with an intense, beautiful clarity that made the dark timber seem to vanish around them. She stated that a name that belonged on the mountain did not hide behind a piece of pine while its home was being defended, and that she had found the iron he had forged in the cabin. Her voice was a rich, lyrical vibration that carried the absolute weight of a near confession, her large hand sliding down, his arm until her calloused fingers locked into his with a grip that could not be broken by any force in the territory. Vance watched the 2 giants stand together, in the flickering glare of the torches, their matched physical size and unbreakable unity creating a terrifying wall of muscle and resolution. The regulators hesitated, their torches trembling as they looked from Silas's scarred, unyielding face to Elara's powerful, blazing glare. They realized that this was no longer a simple arson or a routine retrieval. They were facing 2 outcasts who had found something worth more than gold. and who were prepared to turn the white snow red before they surrendered an inch of the earth they shared. Vance's face turned a sickly, frustrated white in the firelight, his fingers twitching near his holster as he realized that the Tuesday deadline meant nothing against the emotional force that had just been unleashed in the canyon throat. He pulled his coat tight against his chest, his dark eyes narrow with a bitter, desperate malice as he prepared to give the final command that would decide the fate of the mountain. The flickering orange glare of Vance's kerosene torches caught the heavy, frosted pine branches, casting long, frantic shadows across the narrow logging trail. Vance raised his arm to signal his hired regulators, his face twisted in a desperate, venomous sneer. But before he could utter a single word of command, the deep, thunderous echo of a shotgun blast shattered the frozen night air. Echoing off the high granite bluff, the territorial marshal strode out from the thick timber behind Vance's men, his silver star gleaming in the firelight. He held his smoking 12-gauge leveled at the group, flanked by 4 heavily armed deputies who instantly moved to encircle the regulators. The marshal's voice was as cold and sharp as winter ice. He stated that the Tuesday deadline applied to everyone, and that any man who attempted to burn a citizen out of his home under the cover of darkness would face a territorial hanging tree before the week was out. Vance looked at the lawman, then at the broken, bleeding wrist cradled against his chest, and realized his gamble had failed. He dropped his heavy torch into the snow, where it hissed and died in the white powder. The regulators followed suit, their clubs and weapons clattering harmlessly against the frozen rocks. Within minutes, the deputies marched the defeated group down the mountain path, leaving the canyon throat in pristine, quiet peace. Silas turned his massive frame toward Elara, his winter-gray eyes reflecting the soft, silver light of the stars. He did not look at the trail or the departing lawman. His gaze was fixed entirely on her face. He reached out, his large, calloused hands gently cradling her jawline, his thick thumbs brushing away the trace of coal dust and tears from her warm olive skin. He spoke, his voice dropping into a deep, resonant rumble that shook with an emotional catharsis he had held back for years. He told her that he had spent his whole life watching things burn, but that, from the moment she had walked into his life, she had given him a future worth fighting for. He stated that he loved her, not for her immense strength or what her shoulders could carry, but for the profound, beautiful grace of her heart. Elara let out a long, shuddering sigh, her broad chest heaving as the final walls of her lifelong isolation crumbled into nothingness. She leaned her towering height into his massive chest, her powerful arms wrapping around his broad shoulders, holding him with an intensity that matched his own physical power. She whispered into his dark beard, stating that she had spent her entire existence running from a world that wanted to cage her, but that in his quiet forge, beneath his protective shadow, she had finally found the only place where she truly belonged. They walked back to the cabin, together, their heavy leather boots crunching rhythmically in the deep snow, their hands locked tightly between them. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth burned with a steady, comforting warmth, the rich scent of cured hickory and dried lavender filling the air. The small boy was resting peacefully beneath the quilts, his face flushed with a healthy, vital heat. Silas walked over to the woodpile, lifting the hand-forged branding iron containing her name. He placed the face of the iron directly against the thick oak mantelpiece above the fireplace, pressing it into the wood with a steady, unyielding force until the letters Elara, belongs here, were permanently etched into the heart of their home. The long winter months eventually gave way to the soft, golden light of the mountain spring. The heavy drifts in the meadow melted into clear, rushing creeks that fed the wild clover in the valley, and the high pine needles shone with a bright, clean green. Silas's forge remained hot and active. The metallic, rhythmic ring of his 4-pound hammer creating a cheerful harmony that echoed through the peaceful canyon. But he no longer worked alone. Elara stood beside him at the anvil, her towering, muscular frame moving in perfect, fluid synchronization with his own, her powerful arms shaping the iron with an efficiency that had become the pride of the entire territory. The town council, recognizing the absolute quality of their work and the unyielding dignity of their character, had formally restored Silas's freight contract, turning their backs on Miller's greed. The outcasts had not just survived the winter storm. They had conquered the prejudice of the valley by the sheer, undeniable weight of their integrity and their mutual loyalty. They had built a life of absolute safety, respect, and profound emotional fulfillment within the sturdy log walls of the cabin. As the evening sun began to drop behind the western ridge, casting a warm, rose-colored glow across the clearing, Silas and Elara walked out onto the front porch. They stood side by side, their massive shoulders brushing lightly against each other, their chests expanded with the clean, sweet air of the mountain spring. Silas reached down, his large hand wrapping around hers, his gray eyes shining with a deep, earned happiness that carried no trace of his old military guilt. They had both survived the fire. They had both carried the heavy chains of the past. But in the shelter of each other's strength, they had found a redemption that was as permanent as the granite bluff above them. They were finally home, bound by a love that was forged in the heat of the fire and tested by the winter frost, an unbreakable front against the world. The characters, names, incidents, and plot lines portrayed in this historical romance production are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or real-world events is purely coincidental. This narrative is presented strictly for entertainment and narrative artistic purposes, adhering to safety guidelines with a family-friendly PG tone focused on emotional growth and personal redemption. All visual and text assets are property of the creator.